Hey friends, welcome back to another video. My name's Emma Lefebvre, and today we are going to be talking about the Caran NEOCOLOR 2 water-soluble wax pastels, and I have done a couple videos of painting with them before, but today I am actually doing a how to use these tutorial. Step by step, what you need to know about using these beautiful, I call them watercolor crayons. So let's jump right in and get started. Okay friends, so today I am doing an official video on how to use these Caran NEOCOLOR 2 water-soluble wax pastels. So I've done a couple videos where I've swatched them and done a few paintings here and there, but today I really wanted to do like a full video on how to use these things now that I've had some time to practice and play with them, and I absolutely love them. So I will say that I first purchased this set of 15 when I was starting out because I didn't know if I was going to enjoy them. I had bought them alongside my Faber-Castell watercolor pencils, and I ended up loving this set, more so than the pencils. So once I kind of fell in love with this set of 15, I quickly realized I wanted the big set. So I purchased this set of, I don't know if it's 86 or 84 colors. It's a lot of colors. It's excessive for sure, but for me it was necessary. I fell in love and I wanted all the colors. Now I will say you can purchase the colors individually depending on the art store. I will let my Canadian followers know that I was unable to find this set or any set that was any bigger than this set of 15. This was the only one I could find, and it was at an art store called Desiree's, but I could only find the set of 15. For this set, I had to go to the US site Blick, dickblick.com, for Blick art supplies. That's where I purchased these, and I will be transparent with you. They were not cheap. So when you factor in the exchange rate and the shipping, it was a little nauseating how expensive they were. But I'm really happy that I did it just because I absolutely love them. But like I said, at certain art stores, I think Blick is one of them. There's a bunch of other ones in the US. You can actually purchase these crayons individually, and I believe they're only a couple dollars, which is great because then you can pick and choose what colors you want. I was thinking of doing that, and then I couldn't decide, so I got the big pack. But that is an option for you for sure if this is something you just want to try. And then obviously they have smaller palettes like this one of 15. I believe there's one of 30, maybe 40. But definitely check out where they are sold near you. I will put some of the places like blick.com in the description. But for now, let's dive in and see what these guys can do. Okay, so one of the first things I will say is I find that the name of water-soluble wax pastel has been confusing a few people on my Instagram. Some people have said, wow, I didn't know wax pastels could do that. And I just want to reiterate that these are not regular wax pastels. Not every wax pastel can do this. You need to look for the words water-soluble because then you know they are appropriate for watercolor. Regular wax pastel will not do the same thing, so just keep that in mind. I like to call them watercolor crayons because to me, that's just what they feel like. They feel more like a crayon, even though crayons are basically just wax pastels, but they just feel like watercolor crayons. So I have my set of 15 here. One of the videos I have done on my channel in the past little bit is what paper is best for these. So if you want to check that out, you definitely can, but I will let you know that a smoother paper and a rougher texture paper are going to give you different effects. So check that out in the description below for a real in-depth look at what it looks like. But basically, if you have a smoother pressed paper, you're not going to get as much texture. And if you have a more textured paper, you're really going to see the texture of the crayons. I'm going to call them crayons. So for today, I'm just going to be drawing in my son's Canson watercolor sketchbook. This is fairly cheap. You don't need any fancy paper with these, which is excellent because with a lot of watercolor products, I always recommend having the highest quality paper to give them the best chance of looking the best. But you know what? I find these look really good on lots of different varieties of paper. So I'm going to be using that today. But feel free to use whatever watercolor paper you want. Okay, so there are a few different ways to use these, and I want you to think the first way is kind of like our watercolor pencils. If you've seen my tutorial on those before, you'll know exactly how to use them. But basically, these are a crayon, and all you have to do is draw. So you see how you get that crayon kind of texture? And then to make it a watercolor, you're going to take a wet brush, wet clean brush, and you're just going to go over it and kind of render out that color, and it turns into watercolor. So the more you scrub out the surface, the less texture you're going to leave behind. So if I keep going like this over and over and over again, you're not going to see that crayon kind of texture underneath. But if you only do it a little bit, you'll see that kind of texture a bit underneath. So it depends on what kind of look you want to go for. So originally I wasn't a huge fan of texture, so I was very kind of hesitant with these and watercolor pencils, but as I started to use them more and more, I really loved the texture it left behind in my paintings. So I found it was a lot of fun. Also, the more of the crayon that you put down, so if you put down a really thick layer, you're gonna get a lot of dark pigment. If you do less, you're gonna get less pigment, okay? So it's just like watercolor. The more paint or pigment you have on your paper, the darker it's gonna be. The more water you have and the less pigment, the lighter it's gonna be. Okay, so if you wanna have a really nice dark value of a color, you're gonna use more of the crayon. If you wanna have less, you're only gonna have a little bit and then more water. When blending colors together, you can do it a couple ways. So we're gonna do kind of like how I blend with watercolor. I'm just going to do two separate areas here. Let's do purple and like this light blue for fun. Okay, so you can blend two ways. You can put them at opposite sides of the page and then kind of bring them close together. Or you can even just layer them to get a new color. So let's first start with this way. So I'm just going to render it out, start bringing it closer to the middle, like that. Wash off my brush, grab the blue, bring it close to the middle, and there you have a new color. Okay, you can blend it that way. You can even pick up some of that pigment and just start painting with it. The other way is layering them to create that new color like this. The only thing with this is that you might not know how much of each color you have. You might have put a bit more purple down or a bit more blue down, so you might not get an accurate color of what you're going for. But there's a really cool tool that you can use to mix with these watercolor crayons. And that is this awesome palette. So I also got this from blick.com. This is a Caran palette. It's textured on one side and then it's very smooth on the other side. Now, if you want to mix colors together, this is really great for that. So I'm just going to pick two colors here. I'm going to scribble some yellow, and I'm going to scribble some blue. And there's two great ways to use this. So you can use it just to grab color from and start painting like a regular watercolor palette. Again, if you add more water, you're going to get a lighter value. Same thing that applies with regular watercolor. Or you can use it to mix colors. So you can take some of your blue, take some of your yellow, and you've mixed a new color, and then you can just paint like you regularly would with watercolor. So this is so handy for that. I find this is perfect for details. The other thing I love about this is that because you can lift up all the paint, you're not going to be wasting any of that color on your palette, opposed to if you were mixing it on a different paper, you'd be soaking in a lot of that paint. This lifts all the color off, so you're not wasting any. Now, another reason why this is really good is because, like I said, you can use your brush to pick up the color and get these really thin strokes, which is something that I feel like might be a question for a lot of people. Now, like a crayon, it gets pretty dull, right? So people have asked, can you sharpen these? And you can, and I'm going to show you that in just a second. So far, I haven't had a problem with trying to create really tiny lines, but if I do, this is the method I will go with by using the palette and then picking it up with my brush. But if you do want to sharpen it, this is what I'm going to suggest. So I have a sharpener here. And I'm going to grab a palette. Because these are so pricey, you feel like you don't want to waste any. So there are these little tabs you can pull back once it starts kind of coming down and you're using a lot of it. And then you can actually sharpen your crayon. I'm not going to pull it down because it's not too far down. I just have a little sharpener here, and I took it out of here because I don't want it to mix with my pencil shavings. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it in the bigger one, and I'm going to sharpen it just a little bit. And that little bit of crayon that's in there, I'm going to put it into my palette. If you have little containers or jars, I actually suggest saving it because you can use it. So here I'm just going to grab my wet brush and I'm just going to start wetting this all up. And this is for when you want to use it. But you can actually reuse this pigment. Okay? And use it like a regular watercolor paint. Now it's a little chunky right now, but the more you mush it around, the more it will turn into just a regular watercolor paint, which is great. So if you are nervous about sharpening your pencils and losing some of that pigment, don't be. Just get some little jars or a little palette, and you can even let this dry because you just have to add water and it will become watercolor again, like they're water soluble. You can use them from dry, just adding a little bit of water. But there's so many ways that you can use these and save them and get the most out of your crayons without wasting them. So this is a really great way to save those shavings and reuse them again. So I've done a couple small tutorials on my Instagram, but I just wanted to show you some important things that you should consider when you are using them for a subject. So let's say we are trying to create anything that has different values. So let's start with like a ball, for example. Now you don't want to just have one flat color, right? With a ball or a 3D object, you want to create those difference in values so you can create so you can show shadow and depth. So the thing with these is that any area that you want to add a highlight, I would leave white and then use your crayon to make it a little bit darker. So I'm not going to color here, and I'm just going to start going really, really light, because remember, the less pigment you're going to use, the lighter it's going to be. The darker the more of the pigment that you're going to use, so the darker you make it, the darker it's going to be. Okay, and you might actually find that you need to use less than you think. So there we go. And then once you start to use your paintbrush to render it out, always start with the highlighted area. So this white area, I'm just going to add some water here. I'm going to move it around, and then I'm going to start working my way down. Okay, because we want to maintain that light area, that highlighted area. If we started at the darker area, then we would be bringing that pigment up into the highlight, and that would lose that highlighted area and lose that shadow and depth that we're striving for. So you can just slowly start moving to the darker area, and it's actually a fairly easy way to make a color gradient or add in shadows. Okay, and then if you feel like you need to kind of move some color around here, but you have a lot of pigment on your brush from this darker area, just wash off your brush, dry it a little bit, go back to that highlighted area, and just move it around to make it nice and smooth. We're just blending like we would with regular watercolor. Now say this works out, but you want to add a little bit of extra shadow to it, and you just find that you just didn't add enough color there. So maybe I want to add a darker blue. This is where the palette also comes in handy. I can scribble my color there, pick it up with my brush, and then add it in while it's still wet, and it will blend nicely. Okay, my sphere is still wet. My hand's so shaky this morning. And you can add in color that way. Or we can wait for it to dry and come back in. This is a pretty wonky looking sphere here. I'm going to do it two ways. I'll be right back. So the other way to add in that darker shadow is to wait for it to completely dry. So I showed you first picking it up from the palette and then bringing it over while it was still wet, and then it was easier to blend. But if you want to wait for it to dry, you can go right back on top. So make sure it's dry, add another layer of the crayon. And like I said, I would wait for it to be dry because it doesn't layer the same when the surface is wet. This just gets wet and it kind of it doesn't spread as evenly. So I would wait for it to dry. Okay, you can do it like that, where you just go right onto the subject again with your crayon. Like that. Again, start at the highlighted area. You can wet it the whole thing. and it kind of reactivates the whole thing again. And then you can just render it out, getting more of those shadows and depth into your painting. Like that. Or again, you can place more of that color on your palette. It doesn't blend as easily as we did when we did wet on wet, but this is just another one of my blending techniques where you place it on the dry area, wash off your brush, dry it a bit, and then blend it out. Okay, so there's so many ways you can do this. Just make sure you kind of re-wet the whole area again so it's a nice even blend. But there's plenty of ways to do this. And again, you can just keep adding as many layers as you want. Like I said, I would just wait for it to dry first. I'll just show you quickly what it's like when it's wet. So this surface is wet, and then you're going back in. You don't get that same texture. It's not bad. You can still do it. It just doesn't, I don't find it does it as evenly, but it's something to play around with. You end up kind of lifting a lot of that color. Another question that some people may have are, how do these lift? Do these lift like traditional watercolors? So let's give that a try. So lifting techniques are great if you're making mistakes, or maybe if you want to create kind of like a background bokeh area. Lots of different options, but basically what you're doing is taking a wet, clean brush, going over an area, kind of scrubbing gently, and then lifting it. So it kind of lifts. It's not too, it also could depend on your paper. Actually, look, this is coming right up. Okay, it lifts really well. Let's try some other areas. And remember, some colors can stain a little bit easier than others. And I'm not putting a ton of pressure on this. I am scrubbing a bit, but I'm not putting a ton of pressure where I'm going to be pilling my paper. But it does lift fairly well. Another technique that we use a ton in watercolor, which may be another question, is how does the wet on wet technique apply with these watercolor crayons? So we've tried wet on dry, where we did our little sphere and then we waited for it to dry, and then we were able to go back over top. That's wet on dry. But what about wet on wet? So let's wet up our area. Let's re-wet this whole thing here. And now we won't be able to use the crayons like our paintbrush where we drop in the wet color. I mean, we can definitely try, but it's not going to be the same, I'm pretty sure. So let's just take, I don't know, our pink one. It's not going to have that same like explosion. It's really dark. Like, you can draw pretty nicely, but it's not going to have that explosion that you would get with the wet on wet technique. But let's try like this. Okay, so does not have, oh, kind of. There we go. We got a little bit of that wet on wet explosion kind of happening there. Let's just make another wet area here. Let's just pick up a bunch of color. You do get some of those explosions. They're not as big. And we'll have to see how that dries. Now, paper quality may factor a lot into this, because we know that with different paper qualities, wet on wet works better on some than others. So maybe I'll try a little bit on some of my better paper just to see the ability of the wet on wet with these. Okay, here I have some Arches paper. We have to try this. Okay, let's do some orange. So I'm just gonna put my color. Now see the difference in that texture? Very different than the smoother paper, which is the Canson XL. But it renders out really, really nicely. Again, go watch that video and it will show you that the textured paper is actually pretty nice too. So here we go. Here's our wet surface. Making sure it's nice and wet. Then I'm going to grab I'm just going to do a little bit more pink. And it does seem to explode the same. You can get really nice color bleeds by placing it next to that other wet color. So a color bleed is when you have one wet color that's next to another. You get one color that bleeds into the next. So that kind of works that way with the brush. Again, this is just how you kind of have to use them as traditional watercolors to get some of these techniques down. But it is possible. Now, like, what if, I'm curious if we just wet the background. Now, if I wanted to do trees, I don't think it would work the same if I were to just draw it. Yeah, it's like, it's kind of blurry. Oh, that's kind of cool. It's definitely harder to do it. I'm doing it with the back of the crayon because it's a little flatter there. But it is kind of blurry, like the wet on wet effect, with a little bit more texture to it. That's kind of cool. Or you can, again, grab your crayon. Oh, yep, and it works just the same. So for those of you who may be a bit newer to watercolor and be like, wet on wet, what is the purpose of that? Basically, it just creates a really nice soft line where it is a little bit blurry. It's really nice for backgrounds or things you want to have out of focus. It's really great for blending colors together. I have a whole playlist on different techniques, like the wet on wet technique. So these actually work really well for that as well. If you have a nice wet background and then you use it, I think the paintbrush is the best on top. You get quite a lot of texture if you use just the crayon, but it works beautifully with the brush. And the pigments are beautiful. So that's the wet on wet technique with these crayons. Okay, so I was thinking about other questions you guys might have about these, and one of them might be, what kind of brushes do you need to use with these? So you may notice I'm not using my Emma Lefebvre Craftimo brushes with these that I typically use for watercolor. I'm using my etcher ones. And the only reason why I'm doing this is because I have a lot of brushes, but also when rendering out these crayons or wax pastels, you need to use a little bit of, not too much pressure, but just, you're doing a bit of scrubbing. You're not going to be destroying your brushes, but you're not going to be as gentle as you would be with your typical watercolors either. So I just, because I have these as my watercolor brushes for all of my tutorials and stuff, I kind of wanted to keep it just for that. And so I've designated some other brushes, my etcher brushes, for these crayons. Now, you may see me using my other ones with it, but just because I'm going to be a little bit more vigorous with my movements with these, I'm going to try and use these brushes. But what brushes do you need to use these? You just need watercolor brushes. You don't have to have a separate set. You don't have to have anything fancy or special. Whatever watercolor brushes you feel the most comfortable with, if they're snappier, softer, I think working with just like stiffer brushes will be easier to just pick up the paint. But whatever brushes you feel the most comfortable with that are watercolor brushes, I would recommend. For these, I'm just going to be probably using my etcher ones a lot, which I really, really like. But I also love my Craftimo ones, which I am keeping separate just because, like I said, I don't want to be too vigorous with the tip with those ones. So that's one thing. And then, like I mentioned at the beginning, I do have a video where I compare different papers. So the only thing I will mention with this is the paper that you need to use has to be watercolor paper. You can't use printer paper or marker paper because it is still a water soluble supply. You need something that can withhold water and will move freely. And if you look at my video, you will see which ones are the best for that. So paper and brushes, those are the things that I recommend when using these. Now, the other technique that I forgot to mention that I have used a couple times before, if you don't have one of those palettes and you want to pick up color without drawing it on your palette or paper, what you can also do, and I've done this a few times, you can just wet your brush, take the back of the crayon, and actually just lift up the pigment right from the crayon like that. And I've done that a couple times. Like if I need a little bit of black for detail for something, I'll just go right to the bottom of my crayon and get my small black detail, which is pretty great. So that's another thing that you can do. And then the last thing for technique wise, for style wise that I wanted to mention, you can render out your crayon so you get a smoother look. But one thing I've been enjoying, and I don't know if you guys saw my video, I did how to use these or how to paint trees with these. Towards the end, when I was finishing off the trees, I used these over top just for a little bit of extra texture. Like you can just use them as crayons and then just leave it. Like it doesn't have to be rendered out into a watercolor. You can use it for texture. I mean, this green is a little bit lighter, but it just gives it a really nice style. And you can have that extra texture over, which I really, really enjoy. I don't know what I'm drawing here. I'm just like doing lines. But you know what I mean? You can just use that for extra texture. Okay, moving on. So we've gone over a bunch of the techniques that I would use with typical watercolor. And I have to say that these are just so much fun to use. And I don't know exactly what it is necessarily about these that I prefer over maybe my regular watercolors. Like, look, you can blot them for like clouds, like our regular watercolors. Maybe it's the colors that you can get in these packs, or maybe it's just the fact that you can draw with them first, and whatever the drawing is that you come up with is always a surprise. So it's just a little bit more fun to use at times. But either way, I highly recommend you try these out, even getting this pack, because if you get the set of 15, you can still mix almost every color you could ever want. You know, the one thing that I was a little turned off with at the beginning when I got this pack of 15 was the lack of greens. And if you guys know me, you know I love my greens. I use green in so many of my pieces of work, so I was really bummed that they didn't have better greens, but you can always mix them just like regular watercolors. So you can make this beautiful, you know, dark green just by mixing it on the palette. Like, look at that beautiful kind of bluish purpley green. Or you can mix an olive green or a more kind of neutral green. That's not really olive. There we go. So the range of colors that you can mix with this set of 15 is unlimited, and it's also really great for practicing your color mixing. I would definitely suggest that you check these out. I am planning to do more tutorials on my channel using these because I just find them so much fun and inspiring for me to use. I will be using regular watercolor as well, so don't worry, I'm not shying away completely from traditional watercolor, but I'm really excited to incorporate these more into my videos. So let me know in the comments below, what do you guys think of these NEOCOLOR 2 Caran water soluble wax pastels? If there's any specific tutorials you'd like to see using these, I'd love to know, and I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you guys so much for watching my video. I really hope you liked it, and I hope you learned something. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and follow me on Instagram and all my other platforms for tons more content. I'll see you guys again soon. Bye.